is it that some movements succeed and others fail? Let's think about Occupy Wall Street, a group of young students and activists who, with their message of the 99% versus the 1%, inspired people across the country and throughout the world. And then, poof, they were gone, achieving little, if anything at all. Now let's look at a similar group of students and activists, the Serbian resistance movement called Otpor. They began with the nearly impossible dream of bringing down the government of Slobodan Milosevic, who ruled their country with an iron hand. But 2 years later, Milosevic was gone, and Otpor still stood. And they didn't stop there. They created an organization called the Center for Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategies, otherwise known as Canvas. And they began to train activists in other countries. And the tyrannical regimes began to fall. Georgia, Ukraine, Lebanon, Maldives, Egypt. The list goes on. To date, Canvas has been active in over 50 countries. So why? Why does one group fail so completely and another, seemingly so similar, succeed with almost metronomic regularity? To get some insight, I want to take you back to the events that happened in the fall of 2013 in Kiev, Ukraine. At the time, Ukraine was ruled by this man, Viktor Yanukovych, a leader who, even by Ukrainian standards, was one of uncommon corruption and incompetence. But in November of that year, he did something that became the straw that broke the camel's back. And that was to pull out of a trade agreement with the European Union. Now, that might not seem like such a big deal to us. But for Ukrainians, who had become used to corruption and incompetence in their leaders, it represented their last hope of ever becoming a normal country with some semblance of governance. So a guy named Mustafa Nayam, he went to Facebook and he posted this, which I've translated from the Russian. But basically, he called his fellow citizens down to the Maidan, the central square, the Independence Square, in the center of Kiev. And they came. First, just in hundreds, but their numbers quickly grew. And that made the regime nervous. And before long, the police showed up. But they were not met with hurled rocks and insults. Rather, they were met with flowers and piano concertos. And that inspired the people of Ukraine. And even more came out. The demonstrations became truly enormous. Tens of thousands of people flooded the streets. And that made the regime nervous. So they decided to escalate. One night, at about 3 o'clock in the morning, when there was only a few hundred protesters on the Maidan. A special unit of police called the Berkut brutally beat the protesters that were there. But even in the middle of the night, word got out, and people from all over Kiev rushed to the Maidan to defend it, and the movement became even stronger. So the regime, they decided to escalate again, and that's when the shooting started. Before it was done, nearly 100 people were shot dead, and many more were wounded. But by this point, the movement had gone far beyond Ukraine. The eyes of the world were on Kiev. Diplomats from the United States, the European Union, and even Russia came to mediate the crisis. And eventually, they negotiated an agreement with the Yanukovych regime and the opposition politicians. And I remember this point very well, because the night before the agreement was to be signed, I was chatting with a good friend of mine who's a very well-connected Ukrainian journalist. And I asked him, you think the agreement's going to go through? Do you think it'll hold? And he said, you know what? The truth is, it's all being decided tonight. They have a secret meeting down at the parliament. And it looks like Yanukovych's own party has had enough of him. I think they're going to dump him. And the next morning, the Yanukovych regime met with the opposition politicians and the diplomats from US, EU, and Russia, and the agreement was signed. But as Yanukovych left the room, something strange happened. His security detail just seemed to melt into the ether. And the next time we saw Viktor Yanukovych, it was on closed-circuit TV camera. And he was scurrying out of his ridiculously ostentatious mansion, carrying bags of money and other belongings. He got onto a helicopter, and that was the last time anybody saw Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine. Today, he lives in hiding somewhere in Russia. So it's an incredible story, made even more incredible by the fact it wasn't the first time. In 2004, very similar events happened in Ukraine. That time it was called the Orange Revolution, and the issue was a falsified election. So what the world saw was the major opposition politicians, Viktor Yushchenko and Yulia Tymoshenko. But to people in Ukraine, it was clear that the real power emanated from the tent cities. This is the main tent city on Kreshchatyk Street in central Kiev. And I know all this because I was there. That's me in the tent city on Kreshchatyk. And what I saw there was order. People moved with purpose. It was probably the only orderly place in Kiev at the time. Work details were set up to keep everything clean, to keep people fed and clothed and warm. Outside the tent city, protesters handed out flowers to the police. At night, there were massive demonstrations where you could see people of all ages and all walks of life. The Maidan was a place where people wanted to be. It was a place people would take their kids. even pensioners who most fondly remembered the old order and the glory of the Soviet Union. They came as well. Many of them brought food and clothes and blankets for the protesters. And that's how you create transformational change, real change, change that sticks, change that won't be reversed during the next election cycle. You bring everybody in, and you make it their movement too. So in the few minutes I have left, I want to talk a little bit about the science behind two of the most important aspects of transformational change and movements. The first is best illustrated by this series of conformity experiments conducted by Solomon Asch back in the 1950s. And basically the idea is this. If I were to ask you which line on the right best matches the line on the left, how many of you would say A? Well, how many would say B? And how many would say C? So it seems that everybody thinks it's C. What if I were to tell you that the correct answer was A? And what if everybody else in this auditorium agreed that the correct answer was A? Would you still be so sure? And that's essentially what they did. They put together groups of 8 people, 7 of whom were Confederates, who all gave the same wrong answer. And by the time they got to the 8th person, who was the real subject of the experiment, the vast majority of the time, they conformed to the majority opinion, even if it was obviously wrong. You see, majorities don't just rule, they also influence, even if it's only a local majority. Sometimes especially if it's a local majority. And that's what brings us to the first aspect. Small groups, loosely connected, but united by a shared purpose. Because all groups are connected to other groups, which are connected to more groups still. So you can get this cascading effect, like a wave at a stadium. And as we all know, you don't need to be anybody special to create a wave at a stadium. You just need a couple of guys in a crowded section, because it's the structure of networks that best determines their behavior. And this cascading effect is something that we see in both successful and unsuccessful movements. Occupy certainly had it. But that cascading effect is an opportunity and a danger to movements. It's an opportunity because it creates passion and coherence within the movement, but it's a danger because that passionate cohesion makes it very hard to relate to people outside the movement. And that's what brings us to the second aspect. And this is best illustrated by this diffusion of ideas model developed by Everett Rogers. Ideas tend to start in a small group of innovators, spread to a slightly larger group of early adopters, and then on to the early majority, late majority, and finally, even the laggards and the skeptics join in. And that's what we saw in Ukraine, right? In the end, it was Yanukovych's own guys who did him in. Unfortunately, all too often movements get stuck in this early adopter stage, because we can't see these categories just as separate groups of people. They also represent higher and higher thresholds of resistance. So if those early adopters don't really work hard to bring in the mainstream, to bring everybody else in, the movement will die. And that's exactly what we saw happen with Occupy Wall Street. So that brings us to the second aspect. Planning, organization, and discipline. That's what sets the successful movements apart from the unsuccessful ones. You gotta control the rock throwers. And those who believe only the most pure belong. Because students and activists can protest, but it's only when the marketing managers and accountants start hitting the streets that a true revolution can begin. And that's why successful movements work to attract everybody else, to bring in people who weren't standing with them from the beginning. Now I ask you, does that look attractive to you? Does that look like something you would want to join? What about that? Does that look like a place where you would feel like you belonged? Would you bring your kids there? Successful movements inspire. They bring people in. Because power will not fall simply because you oppose it, but it will crumble if you bring those who support it over to your side. Thank you very much.